Good afternoon from the CERN Live Studios in Geneva. This morning at 5:34 Central European Time in Kourou, the third automated transfer vehicle, the ATV3, Edoardo Amaldi, has been launched successfully from the European spaceport in Kourou by the European Space Agency. ATVs are automated spaceships that are used to supply the International Space Station with cargo, heavy payload, food, fuel, since the termination of the American Space Shuttle program. We'll learn more about ATV further on, but today we are here to celebrate ATV3's successful launch from CERN, not just because of our good relations with the European Space Agency, but mostly because this ATV, launched just 10 hours ago from Kourou, was named after CERN's first Secretary General, Edoardo Amaldi, who was also a pioneer of the European Space Agency. To celebrate this event here with us in the studio at CERN, we have Professor Ugo Amaldi, who is Edoardo Amaldi's son and a physicist for a long time at CERN, Professor Carlo Rubbia, Nobel laureate for physics and Director General of CERN from 1989 to 1993, and Arturo Russo, historian, who contributed to the history both of the European Space Agency and of CERN. And we have the recorded contribution of Simonetta Di Pippo from the European Space Agency, advisor to the Director General, and from our Director General, Professor Rolf Hoyer, who could not be with us right now. So for those of you who have not been bold enough to wake up at 5 this morning and watch the launch at 5:30 in Europe, let's watch the launch replay, courtesy of ESA.
Then a gyro ignition of the Vulcan 2, followed by verifications and liftoff with ignition of the SOBs.
Attention pour le décollage. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, unité, top, allumage Vulcain. Allumage confirmé. Top, allumage EAP, décollage. Tous les paramètres à bord sont nominaux.
Well, we lost her to the low clouds early, but in a blaze of light, there she is coming back out of the clouds.
Tous les paramètres à bord sont normaux. La trajectoire est nominale.
Is normal, propulsion and trajectory. In a blaze of light and a trail of gold as Ariane 5 reaches into the skies.
On la voit encore malgré les nuages ici. Ils ne sont pas si nombreux. Un panache de feu, un panache de fumée que les caméras de Guyane Première sous la houlette de Manuel de Oliveira nous montrent en gros plan maintenant.
Le lanceur vient de passer en vol
superbe. Et on entend maintenant le bruit parce qu'effectivement il y a le décalage du son et on entend ce son impressionnant ici qui rugit maintenant à Jupiter.
Voilà, et pour l'heure, tout se passe normalement. La courbe de vol qui va s'afficher sur vos écrans bientôt représente la trajectoire prévisionnelle du lanceur et un pointeur carré va matérialiser le vol réel d'Ariane 5.
Les paramètres à bord sont normaux. La trajectoire est nominale.
La trajectoire est nominale. On entend Daniel Simon et en ce moment les EAP, eh bien, ils assurent 90% de la poussée.
Voilà, chaque EAP contient 240 tonnes de propagole solide. Il consomme en moyenne 2 tonnes par seconde.
Particularité des EAP, vous le savez, une fois allumés, il est impossible de les éteindre.
Alors il est impossible de les éteindre, il est impossible de les réguler. Un soin tout particulier est apporté aux paramètres balistiques, notamment l'écart maximal toléré à l'allumage entre les deux EAP n'est que de 25 millisecondes.
And this was Kourou this morning at 5:34. Always a lot of emotion involved in space launches. I guess this morning for you, Professor Amaldi, and for the members of your family, this was a special day. Can you tell us about what happened if you were up so early, I guess, to watch it?
Yes, I was there until the end of the live broadcast, around, and my son, Edoardo Amaldi, a mathematician, was in Kourou, just representing the family. And I also got from other members of the family some SMS later when the broadcast was finished. It is very important to remember that Edoardo Amaldi was in Kourou, in fact, in 1985, because I remember very well, he was chair of the Scientific Policy Committee of ESA in the 80s when the difficult decision was taken to get the next first planetary mission by ESA called Giotto to the Halley Comet. And he was invited, of course, 5 years later, because it was not an easy decision to go there, and he came back enthusiastic about the view of this startup of the Giotto mission, which, by the way, was a great success.
Thank you, Professor Amaldi. We have another exceptional witness here with us who knew Edoardo Amaldi personally. He wrote his biography. Professor Rubbia, you are at CERN since 1961. You lived through the main milestones of this laboratory. You won the Nobel Prize in 1984. You've been DG from 1989 to 1993. And you knew personally Edoardo Amaldi. What is your personal recollection of this important character?
I think we're going back something like half a century. To recall, we all were young people. At the time I was in Pisa, at Scuola Normale, and Edoardo Amaldi and many others were, in fact, mostly close to us. It was a small team, eventually. And in fact, there was Amaldi, there was Bernardini, there was Beppe Occhialini. And also, they all came after a renaissance of the Italian physics, which elementary particle physics, which came after the war. And this was essentially dominated by the work of Pacini, Piccioni, and Conversi, which demonstrated for the first time the muon was not the pion, and they fundamentally opened the way to the elementary particle physics as we know. In that general framework, Edoardo Amaldi was the boss. He was in charge of Rome. He was the professor of physics at the University of Rome. He was totally esteemed and respected by everyone within the country. And I must say that those were extremely exciting times, because we should not forget not only the past, but also the future. And during those times were the times in which, for instance, the colliding beams between electrons and positrons were developed. And in fact, we had Bruno Tuschek was, in fact, professor of physics in Rome. And he was coming, for instance, with us in Pisa many times, because he was giving a course to us. There was Radicati di Brozzolo also, many others. So there was a very lively and beautiful community of Italian scientists, which, grown after the war, after great difficulties, built up a very exceptional results, which were a necessary premise for creation of a much wider program, was the creation of a European system, of a system based on CERN and other places. So Italy was certainly one of the most remarkable components which were used in building up the elementary particle physics at the level of Europe. Without Italy, we would not have had such a situation as yet in the past. And certainly, the Amaldi, was sure, together with Bernardini and others, were instrumental in this. And we all, young people, were tremendously excited to see all these things happening.
And definitely Edoardo Amaldi is remembered as a physicist. He was one of the ragazzi di Via Panisperna of the Fermi group in Rome. And ESA has recognized his role by naming the third automated transfer vehicle after him, which is an important recognition, especially coming from ESA, where they are not particle physicists, basically, and especially after ATV1, named after a science fiction writer, Jules Verne, and ATV2, named after Johannes Kepler, an astronomer, and before ATV4, named after Albert Einstein. We've asked Simonetta Di Pippo, who is special advisor to the Director General of the European Space Agency and former Director of Human Spaceflight, to explain the origins of this choice at ESA.
It has been a great pleasure for me and a great honor too, when in 2010, in my capacity of Director of Human Spaceflight at the European Space Agency, I managed to get approved by the European contributing member states the naming of the Automated Transfer Vehicle number 3. And this is because the approved name indeed was Edoardo Amaldi. There are a lot of reasons why ESA did that. The most important one in my mind is that we wanted to honor a man who, for the first time in history, pushed the idea of creating a European organization devoted to peaceful space activities. The ATV is a cargo resupply spacecraft built in Europe and partially in Italy. This is a very complex spacecraft, key for the survival of the International Space Station and its crew. Therefore, in a nutshell, the ATV represents the evidence of how Edoardo Amaldi was right in pushing the development of space research and technologies in Europe.
And now comes the time for a question to our historian, Professor Arturo Russo. You're one of the authors, we said before, with John Krieg and others, of both the history of CERN and the history of ESA. So I would like to ask you, are you surprised of this decision by ESA to appoint a particle physicist at the origins of CERN, an ATV that is a space vessel?
In fact, I'm not surprised. I would say that it's very appropriate to honor Eduardo Amaldi in this occasion, because in the difficult years of the post-war Europe, as Professor Rubbia reminded us, Amaldi was one of the few scientists who had a vision about European cooperation in science and in general European cooperation. His efforts were very important in establishing CERN, for example, where we are sitting now. And, but then after CERN, he thought that the next step should be in space. He was not a space physicist, but in 1958, when the first Sputniks and explorers were already orbiting the Earth, he thought that it was the moment to get Europe also into space, not for ideological reasons, but for scientific research and for fostering the European ideal. So he started discussing with his friends at CERN, fellow scientists and policy makers, and in 1958, and eventually after these discussions, he wrote an outline of this European Space Research Organization, how it was called at that time, in a letter to his friend and colleague Gino Crocco in Princeton. And eventually, after 1 year of further negotiations and discussions between scientists and diplomats, in January 1960, here at CERN, there was the first General Assembly of the United Nations Committee for Space Research. And in that occasion, the idea of a European Space Research Organization was for the first time discussed at governmental delegate level. Then it took a few years again to arrive at the officially establishment of the European Space Research Organization, but the route had been put by Eduardo Amaldi in those 1958 months.
So that's good that the European Space Agency recognizes that. We can live through those times back again in the next video clip from European Space Agency about Eduardo Amaldi, pioneer of ESA.
ATV Eduardo Amaldi is the third automated transfer vehicle. It'll carry more than 6 tons of supplies up to the ISS.
So welcome to the ATV.
Among this much-awaited cargo, a copy of a visionary letter. Written in 1958, it details the project of creating a European space agency. Its author was the late Eduardo Amaldi, the Italian physicist, world famous for his works on gravitational waves. His pioneering views on space were a main driving force of what has become, since 1975, the European Space Agency. As early as 1949, just after World War II, Eduardo Amaldi, a 41-year-old physicist from the Nobel Prize-winning Fermi Group in Rome, had the initial idea of creating CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. In record time, CERN became the successful European laboratory for particle physics with the first synchrotron, a proton accelerator built in 1959, 1 year before its US counterpart. The following year, strongly inspired by his European vision of scientific research, Eduardo Amaldi met in Paris with his friend Pierre Auger, French physicist and UNESCO scientific director, who was also working on similar ideas to create a European space organization. These two key figures of the Western European scientific community joined forces as they had done a few years before for CERN, to convince the European governments to set up a purely scientific organization for space research. Success led rapidly in 1964 to a 10-European nation organization and later to ESA, the actual European Space Agency. The naming of ATV3 after the world-famous Italian physicist also reflects the industrial importance of Italy, where the pressurized module is manufactured at Turin's Thales Alenia space plant. All his life, Eduardo Amaldi was committed to the development of European science in every field, to maintain European scientific leadership and to stop the brain drain from Europe.
À l'image EAP, décollage.
In the same spirit, the European Space Agency keeps up the tradition of naming its most advanced automated spaceships with the names of great European visionaries, like Jules Verne, Johannes Kepler and Eduardo Amaldi. to reflect Europe's commitment to science, technology and culture.
It's now time to go back to the present. The ATV3 is traveling in space. On the 28th of March, it will reach the space station and dock with it. To welcome it, a crew of astronauts, in particular André Kuipers, who requested to receive some tulips in being brought to him up to space. Let's view now this video again of the European Space Agency, where they explain more about the ATV, their role for the space station and the European Space Programme, and to see how André Kuipers is getting ready to receive his tulips.
Since the end of the shuttle flights, Europe's automated transfer vehicle, ATV, is not just the largest space ferry to the International Space Station, it is also today the world's heaviest spacecraft, now embarking on its third mission. Since its arrival in Kourou last August, ATV3 has been loaded with dry cargo, gases and fuels. Before the two sections of the spacecraft were mated, the integrated cargo carrier module was packed brim full. About 100 bags were securely fitted into its 8 supply racks, 2 more than on the first 2 missions. Each item, bar-coded for easy identification during unloading, was optimally placed to distribute the mass in the carrier section. The ATV3 manifest includes fresh food, clothing, supplies, spare parts, experiments, and memorabilia in honor of Edoardo Amaldi, the visionary Italian physicist, including a letter that he wrote in the late 50s to a colleague in which he envisaged uniting Europe's space efforts. Last January, the fully assembled spacecraft saw a series of delicate fueling operations. This included some 5,400 kilograms of fuel to control the attitude of the International Space Station and to reboost it higher, plus 860 kilograms of fuel that will be transferred to the Russian segment of the orbital complex. 100 kilograms of gas, air and oxygen were also pumped into ATV3's reservoirs and 280 litres of drinking water. But loading was not complete. The ATV's late loading possibility has been greatly improved, doubling the amount of supplies that are lowered only a few days before launch into the freighter's pressurized cabin through the craft's forward hatch and docking port. Until now, this was limited to items with a maximum mass of 30 kilos, but special equipment and procedures have been developed to allow an item of about 60 kilograms to be inserted, a NASA water recycling unit required aboard the space station.
Since the stock of potable water on the ISS is not infinite, and they need either to bring new potable water, which the ATV is doing, by the way, also in parallel, but also to be able to reuse, to recycle the wastes which are generated in orbit. And this is just the normal life aboard the space station.
In all, about 60 bags, some 530 kilos of last-minute items were loaded, once again proving the ATV's capacities and versatility as a space freighter. When the amount of cargo of all kinds is totted up, the Edoardo Amaldi will be carrying another record-breaking amount of supplies, nearly 7 tons, to the ISS.
Tulips is of course a bit of a problem because everything you bring on board has to go through all kind of testing, and it has to, for example, food has to stay well for a year, for example. You cannot just put something in a box because it has to be packed months before and it's not cooled. So I don't think that if I put some tulips in a box that it will arrive in the station in the same shape.
So, Professor Amaldi, special cargo, over 3 tons of fuels, 2 tons of experiment, 100 kilos of gas, but also something smaller, but definitely more precious and more exceptional. This famous letter your father wrote to Gino Crocco. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes, I have here with me a facsimile of this letter, which is written, of course, in Italian, because Gino Crocco was a student in Rome at the time of, in the 20s, and then became professor of propulsion, jet propulsion in Princeton. They met in summer '58 at home of Professor Salvini, and in this document there is a letter of Giorgio Salvini who tells about this meeting they had. Then there is the Italian letter and an English translation, and the letter is 5 pages long and describes in great detail what should be done to set up a new organization. I just read few sentences because they link this new adventure to the one that Amaldi did with many others, as Carlo Rubbia has just recalled us, years before for CERN. The second sentence is, the launch of one or more Aeroluna performed by a dedicated European organization would definitely be of the highest importance, both moral and practical, for all the nations of the continent. First moral and second practical. Then later he says, I think that it's absolutely imperative, underlined, for the future organization to be neither military nor linked to any military organization. It must be a purely scientific organization open, like CERN, to all forms of cooperation, both inside and outside the participating countries. And finally, the last sentence, it is very interesting because it was written on 16th of December, just before Christmas. So, and they were friends since youth. So, and my father has been in Princeton many times. So it ends saying, in Italian of course, but this is the English translation, I take this opportunity for sending you and your wife my best wishes, including among them the wish for an Aeroluna before 1965.
What was this Aeroluna?
Aeroluna was the name he gave from the beginning to this adventure. I still remember sitting at lunch with my mother, my younger brother and sister, and he saying at lunch, once, I cannot date it of course, yesterday on the train I thought that now we must build an Aeroluna. He meant now, after CERN, almost ready with the startup of the PS. When we arrived at CERN with Carlo Rubbia, we were a young scientist, and the PS was just starting or just started. He had been at the beginning on it, and he thought that on prototyping as CERN, a new organization to do space research for science, and also because he was convinced that this would bring technological developments.
Professor Russo, from your historical perspective, can we say that ESA and CERN have common roots?
Yes, in a way, yes. Post-war Europe was destroyed, was morally destroyed, and the idea of pulling together resources, intellectual, moral resources, scientific, technical resources, was something that appeared in the late 40s, early 50s, almost impossible or very, very difficult. There were a few people who had this vision, a vision of a Europe cooperating at the frontier of knowledge. And Amaldi was one of those people. Pierre Roger was another. There were many others. But in this sense, there was a common root. And the other idea, if something must be done in science and technology, we are after the atomic bomb. This must be done without any military implication. That was the second tenet of Amaldi's vision. Western European cooperation to compete with the two superpowers, no military link, and scientific control over the whole endeavor. These three elements were present in CERN and were also present in the forerunner of ESA, namely the European Space Research Organization. And in some way, they are still present in the today's European Space Agency.
Science at the frontier and no military implication.
Yes, and not only in these two organizations, but there are other scientific organizations at the European level. The European Southern Observatory, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, and which helped in building up a European citizenship. People working here in ESA, in ESO, in NMBL feel European citizens, and this is very, very important in the prospect of European unification.
So you quoted before this period in 1960 when the PS started. We have a recollection of that time, the speech that Edoardo Amaldi pronounced on the day when the PS was inaugurated at CERN, after already beating the record of the most powerful accelerator in the world at the time. Let's view the speech of Edoardo Amaldi at the ceremony of dedication of the proton synchrotron.
Et c'est maintenant le professeur Edoardo Amaldi, président du comité des directives scientifiques du CERN, qui déclare que cette institution place aujourd'hui les pays européens à l'avant-garde dans le domaine de la physique des hautes énergies.
Whose work under the leadership of the Director General has amply fulfilled the most optimistic.
Le personnel du nouveau synchrotron et surtout leur chef, John Adams, qui a conçu et construit cette extraordinaire machine, ont obtenu un succès encore plus éclatant qu'on osait l'espérer. Le synchrotron a en effet atteint une énergie de 29 milliards d'électronvolts, alors qu'on n'en prévoyait que 25 milliards, et un faisceau de protons 10 fois plus intense que prévu.
Whereas according to the original program, it was only intended to be 25 GeV. And what is still more important, the intensity of the circulating proton beam is higher than the expected value by a factor of 10.
We wish you a future of new discovery, of deeply increased understanding of nature.
Voice at the end of Edoardo Amaldi's contribution was Robert Oppenheimer, also at the inauguration of the PS. Professor Rubbia, those were the years where you were just starting at CERN. You have been witnessing and living those years personally. You've been witnessing the main milestones of this laboratory, and not just with your Nobel Prize in 1984, but also with the LEP years, with the birth of the LHC, and also the birth of ESA and ESO. You have witnessed the vision of Amaldi and his contemporaries becoming true at CERN. Can you tell us more about those magic years of CERN?
Well, the vision that Europe should get scientifically discovery-like united was a general idea. Everybody would agree that that was a thing to do. And in fact, Russo, you already mentioned quite clearly the variety of activities which all came together as a part of a common patrimony. We had elementary particle physics with CERN, which was a starter, if you like, but then we had ESA, we had ESO, the European Southern Observatory, which is unbelievably interesting today, is developing magnificently with development. We had MBL, we had development of biology, many other activities which were truly European initiatives, which were born, how can I say, before European Union. One should not forget that CERN was developed many years before European Union was created. And then it therefore was a dream coming out of the ashes of the war. You should not realize how difficult the time after the war was, with all the countries split apart. And there was a clear mission of everybody. Every single scientist in Europe was convinced that Europe should have a European story. Amaldi was, of course, instrumental into this, but many, many people realized that. And now this is becoming a reality. As you hear today, in many fields of science, Europe has taken a leadership. It's a leadership in elementary particle physics. We'll hear something about that. It's a leadership in the question of European space. ESA is certainly a very remarkable initiative. Is a premier institution in ESO, European Space Observatory in Chile, where you have a large number of discoveries coming up, discovery of the planets and so forth and so on. It's true for biology. MBL is there. So, I mean, Europe has built up a structure which is truly European, which is a premise to creation of Europe of politics. The science is a prerequisite as a creation. It's much easier to put scientists together because scientists speak the same language. They have equations. But it is a necessary step which created then a European of society, of culture, of European Union, which is a second necessary step. So it would seem to me that it is certainly true that that Europe started as a dream, and it still is a dream, and I hope that it will continue to be so in spite of the great difficulties we have ahead of us.
Thank you very much, Professor Rubbia. We now take the view of our current Director General, Rolf Heuer, whom we asked what is the future like for European science? What's the next step after the Europe of Science United?
I think it's on a good way. We have very good role models of European institutions, European infrastructures like CERN, ESA and ESO. And when you go from the national level to the European level, then you have to keep in mind the result is usually, and in all these three cases at least, is more than the sum of its parts. And this is very important to realize that once you go cross-boundary, cross-cultures, cross-nations, you gain. And that people are learning now, seeing now. But I think we should not stop here. We have to go beyond Europe. We have to create new infrastructures, new institutions along the models of CERN, ESA and ESO, but in a global context. So we have to change our way to work not only in Europe, but with the world, for the world, and with the world together. And to my mind, CERN is in a very good way here. So in a little bit a jokey way, let's say, we have changed the E, the meaning of the E in CERN from Europe to everywhere. And I think that's the way to go. We should keep our European kernel, but become global. And then we are world class.
So the Europe of science is certainly a reality nowadays, and I'm sure Edoardo Amaldi would be very happy to hear that the next step is global, to go global. I would like to give a sincere thanks to our guests for being with us today to share this emotional launch of this morning. I would like to thank the viewers for joining us, and I would like to say good luck to the ATV on its 6-day voyage to the International Space Station to dock on the 28th of March with the station. And I would like to congratulate ESA for the successful launch that they offered us. Let's review the launch, and goodbye to everyone.
The launch vehicle is on the launch pad some 13 kilometers away from here, being prepared by the launch teams in the Launch Control Center, 3 kilometers away from the pad.
We're going to go up there in just a minute with the camera.
That's right.
And you can see closer up.
And if all these systems are good and great, then they have authorization to go ahead.
Attention pour le décollage. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, unité, top. Allumage Vulcain. Allumage confirmé. Top. Allumage EAP. Décollage. Tous les paramètres à bord sont nominaux.
Well, we lost her to the low clouds early, but in a blaze of light, there she is coming back out of the clouds, roaring off the pad. The DDO says everything is normal, propulsion and trajectory. In a blaze of light and a trail of gold as Ariane 5 reaches into the skies above French Guiana on her way to deliver ATV3, which will make her way to the International Space Station next week.
We've lost her through the clouds. So the launch vehicle first clears the pad in a vertical rise. And you can start hearing the noise. And the launch vehicle has just passed Mach 1. It's past the speed of sound. 6 kilometers in altitude, 317 meters per second.
773 tons at liftoff. She's burning 5 tons of fuel every second, 2.5 tons in each booster. Those are the big flames on either side. And the EPC, the core stage, in the center is burning another 300 kilos per second.
1 o'clock and 34 minutes. Beautiful scenes in the night of French Guiana. The first phase of flight, where the boosters throw 90% of the thrust. Then separation, around 2 minutes later. And then once we are at an altitude of around 106 kilometers, the separation of the fairing. We no longer need it, and we don't want to bring unnecessary weight with us. And then finally, separation of the EPC, extension, separation, and the startup of the EPS engine. a long boost, which went perfectly normal, very smooth, and then a very long coast phase while we wait to get to the apogee of this intermediate orbit for the final boost. Yes, we're at this point, we're at the end of the mission, we're waiting for the very last point, the separation.
Séparation ATV3, Eduardo Amaldi.
And it's been confirmed. We've had separation, and it's been acquired by the launch vehicle.
And the applause heralding the good news. Ariane 5 once again delivering, successfully separating her passenger, the ATV3. You see what that looks like up there. Luca explained the spring system, which releases the 20-ton payload. She's on her way now to join the International Space Station. Docking should occur the night of the 30th. Right on target at 269 kilometers up. So the mood, as you see, very buoyant now and all across the Space Center from being focused moments before.
It's a very good step, very good step. Not yet the end by far, but the launch, one step, the deployment of the solar panel, a second step, so I think that it's two good steps at start.
For ESA, it's really the illustration of the savoir-faire, the know-how, because when you think of what happened those last months between Soyuz, Vega, and now this, I mean, you must be a very happy Director General.
Yes. It's not only ESA, it's also all industry which is behind these three events. But it's true that the launch of Soyuz in October, the launch of Vega in February, the launch of today with Ariane 5 and ATV3, yes, it's a fantastic 6 months. And because today the picture is very different compared to 6 months ago, meaning that we are now a significant space power. I can say that.
Thank you.
Thank you.